Welcome to the Teach Me series. We're here to help IT professionals and people getting into the IT industry by answering all of your questions and helping you overcome your challenges. My name is Art Ocain.
Hey, how you guys doing? My name is Apolinario. I am a technical trainer. I do training in IT support system admin. I've been in IT for several years now, and that's pretty much it about me. So, hi Mackenzie, how you doing?
I'm good, hanging in there.
Mackenzie, what do you do at Strong?
So at Strong Industries, I'm involved in anything and everything IT related. I've been here in that role for a little over 5 years now. Anything that plugs in and lights up, hopefully blinks green. From that stuff all the way to software and new process implementation, throughout our manufacturing facility.
Yeah, and Strong Industries is a manufacturer, so he's dealing with that kind of environment. So, Mackenzie, thank you for being our first victim on our Teach Me series and being so gracious and willing to jump on here with some questions. I know that you're dealing with a lot of changes in the next year at Strong and a lot of kind of digital transformation. So, throw a question out here and we'll get it started.
Yeah, so speaking of changes, I guess I'll start with a little bit of background, what we're going through the company right now, a major one. We're trying to migrate our entire ERP system from a self-managed solution to, one that's essentially managed with another provider, third-party hosted solution. We previously, would handle the database and, with some help with some experts, but handle our database for our application that manages our accounting, our manufacturing, customer service, and manage those servers ourselves, with the help of Airiam and some others. But, we're looking to, shoot that off to a third party, with their own servers, their own team to manage that. So we definitely have some concerns about, our data keeping the data integrity, what happens, if something happens with that company, things of that nature, who all has eyes on it, what kind of controls are in place, what we should really look out for, what we should be asking about.
And this sounds like it's obviously a complicated decision. The initial decision, obviously, is to get a lot of the risk and the operational problem of hosting all that stuff out of your own data center and into a SaaS provider or a hosted solution, or someone else take care of the mess and we'll just use it. And so that's the driver. But then as you're going, you're like, oh, well, they're going to have all our data. So what happens if they go down? What happens if we don't like them? If we signed up for this thing and it's awful and we need to get out, how do we get our data back? Like, how are we able to back up our data from their system? Are we able to export it? Things like that. So yeah, there's obviously some rich conversations that have to happen there. Kevin, does anything come to mind from you when you're hearing really what Mackenzie's going through as far as just some of the risk involved and some of the things to think about?
Yeah, for me, like I always tell everyone, like that they're like when we talk about cybersecurity and just security in general, like you should have every company should have a playbook. So what would happen if this were to happen? What would happen if that would happen? And then the other conversation that comes in mind in my head are tabletop exercises. Like what would you do if this were to happen? That would happen. Like actually like creating a scenario of what would happen and what would you do and who would it affect? Who wouldn't it affect? Would it affect the public? Would it not affect the public? What's confidential, what's not confidential, and what information is being leaked out. So those things are very valuable when it comes to cybersecurity or just security in general. It's just like knowing the integrity and knowing what's going to happen when that data is captured and who's it going to affect, and versus the public sector versus the private sector and stuff like that. That's just my intake on that. So
right, that's a great way to look at it. It sounds like almost that the incident response plan at Strong needs to kind of involve those third-party vendors, and those third-party vendors have to, either be willing to participate in the tabletop exercise or, be cooperative with Strong when they're kind of developing what their business continuity needs to be. And when you went through data classification, you just kind of breezed over it there, Kevin. But when you're talking about confidential versus not confidential information, what is private data that would hurt strong if it was leaked versus what's actually okay to lose? And if it ends up on a breach site, and is there some kind of controls and protection around that? So, Mackenzie, when you've talked to this vendor, have they given you any kind of assurances, either in writing or talking to their technical engineers about really what they're doing about controls?
I believe that we have gotten an overview. I haven't reviewed those documents. So I do know that they manage it in in large data centers, large company. But as far as the nuts and bolts, I don't believe I have that information.
Oh yeah. And that's kind of normal. Like, everybody, it's a big brand that you're outsourcing to, so it's kind of assumed that they're taking care of everything, but a lot of times we don't really know. So it's probably worth it to send them even just an email or a questionnaire and just say, hey, just for our own audit assurance and for our own due diligence, can you just let us know what you guys are doing about backups, what you guys are doing about perimeter security, encryption of our data, what you're doing about DR, what's our way to get back up and running if your entire system goes down? Do you spin it up in another data center? Do you have a DR solution in place? And what's the time frame on that? I know that in your contract, they usually kind of guarantee you'll have 99.99% uptime. That's cool, guarantee-wise, and the guarantee may say, yeah, you'll get, a month off your bill if we are down for more than 5 days or something like that. But in the end, that doesn't cut it when they have all your data. So yeah, it's cool that you gave us a month off our bill, but you're causing us to be completely down, and you lost all of our data. So what is your actual DR plan? It's okay if you're going to be down for 3 or 4 days, fine. We want to know how to get back up and running, and what's your plan behind that. So I think those kind of frank conversations, and just be like, we're still planning on signing the contract, or it's already signed. We're still going to go through this migration. We just want to know this for our own documentation, and that's something that they should be. Whether your account rep should be able to pass that on to whoever at the company to find that out. Anything that you're thinking of, Kevin, that kind of you might want to add to
that? Not really. I agree with you 100%. So when I worked for one of our companies for a hedge fund, and that was one of our questions too, because we had a disaster recovery plan, and basically when we were like, what would happen if we were to do like a red team engagement and we were to attack your servers and everything? Like, would it go to site A, site B, site C? Like, what would happen? So, similar to what you mentioned, like there's supposed to be like, I know there's going to be vulnerabilities and stuff like that, but you should have everything like backed up. Like, what's your backup solution? What's your plan A? What's your plan B? What's your plan C? Specifically, me, when I talked about that, because like I work with a company, they did a DDoS attack. The company couldn't do anything, and they were down for a couple of days, and it was just like, did you guys really thought this out? Like, did you have a plan B? Like, Kevin, no, we didn't have a plan B. So we don't put all your eggs in one basket. So you want to make sure that you really plan it out when it comes to those things.
Yeah, and a lot of times, I mean, this may be hindsight's 2020 too, but with every future like SaaS engagement or hosted provider contract renewal or whatever, just make sure there's things. One is called a right to audit clause. So make sure that there's in your contract that you have a right to audit their security, their DR plans, stuff like that. So you may never audit it, but you just want that in there in case like you want to ask them security questions, and it, it's a breach of contract then if they're refusing to answer those questions. And then as far as one thing that's important to me, and I've had to learn this lesson, several times I have had to learn this lesson through buying software and moving all of our clients to cool software, but then when you want to move them to another piece of software, you find that you can't move your data. Your data is locked up in their stuff, and there's no way for you to export or migrate your data out. So making sure that that's in the contract somewhere, that your data belongs to you and you have the right to export it at any time. That is something that I've learned to kind of look for and add to those agreements, and that's something that you may want to think of going forward, with any future ones that you guys are doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So are there any other questions or thoughts around that you have, Mackenzie?
Yeah. I know, at Airiam, you got a lot of resources. Are there any templates, that you guys offer for those questionnaires and ways to engage these vendors, for companies like us, so we can, push us out there and be like, hey, we'd really appreciate answers to these concerns?
Yeah, there's definitely questionnaires for third-party audit, and for third-party risk assessment. Third-party risk assessment has only become really popular in the security community since SolarWinds happened. After when SolarWinds Orion breach happened in 2020, that affected every enterprise because everybody was using SolarWinds. And then suddenly Russian hackers have access to basically everybody's SolarWinds environment. So people didn't really care about the third-party risk as much before that. There was still, at enterprise scale, there was still due diligence and things like that, but it didn't become common until after SolarWinds, and now everybody's concerned about it. So, there's a couple approaches. There are a lot of templates online, and we can get you one. We don't really have a standard that we use for everybody, but we can definitely hook you up. But there are also the cyber insurance forms that you get every year from your cyber insurance company. If you guys have cyber insurance, that cyber insurance renewal form is usually kind of asks the same questions that you would want to ask your provider. How do you back up your data? How do you, because your insurance company is trying to address their risk with you. And so you can really use those same questions to address your risk with these companies. Is saying, do you have EDR? How are you protecting the data? Do you have it encrypted? Is it being backed up? What's your maximum downtime? That kind of stuff. And it could, insurance form is usually a couple pages, but it's usually a pretty quick questionnaire. And a lot of these organizations, especially the bigger ones that you're getting hosted applications from, or you're getting SaaS stuff, they have systems to be able to answer your questions very quickly for that third-party risk. So it's not really a burden on them to fill it out. A lot of them have almost like an AI-driven thing where you feed in your questions, and it gives you the answers based off of their risk database. So it is something that the companies are used to answering. But yeah, we can definitely get you those kind of resources. But the Third Party Risk Association, I'm a member of that. But you can become a free member of the TPRA, and they have some resources as well as far as being able to address third-party risk with companies like we're talking about.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Yeah. Now, did you have any other questions today?
Yeah. So, certain vendors that you might deal with, they might outsource their work that they do for you, to yet another provider. In your experience, what kind of disclosure, can I, should I be demanding, or asking for, in those scenarios as to, who these people are, where they're at, so I can maybe find out what they're about. We're currently in a situation, in HR where they're trying to implement an online onboarding system for employees, and the provider that they're working with, like, we know they outsource their technical work. We've seen that they've done that with other work that they've done with us for our website. This was just recently brought to my attention that this was a thing that was occurring. So I like to see, prepare us, to engage in this, these conversations with this company to, make sure that, not only, the company jewels, if the other thing are safe, but in this case, the employees, jewels are safe.
Absolutely. There's a lot of risk there and a lot of data, especially with HR data, to go through third parties that may use subcontractors. And subcontractors are super popular. I know I've done subcontracting gigs. I know we at Airiam have done subcontracting gigs. Kevin, have you ever picked up any subcontractor gigs where you're kind of doing a short gig for someone?
Yeah, so normally we would work with recruiting firms, and that those recruiting firms typically they hire you for a certain amount of time. So it could be like contract to hire, contract for 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and they would work with the HR team, and then based on that information, you could actually reach out to to that recruiting firm, and then they'll give you information about that employee, that employer, whoever the employee is, and what their qualifications are, what they do, what is their past history, what is their past experience. So I'm familiar with that perspective from going from
Yeah.
getting a job that way. And then also what I tell everyone, some companies have their own intranet, which is like the intranet is basically you log in and you're able to see the employees in there, or they'll use like Workday, right? So you have Workday, you actually could log in and see the employees that way too, who work for you, like do your outsourcing. So all that data and information, you have to reach out and actually see where you could get it from and see who that person is, what their reputation is as an individual, and see what they have done in their achievements and stuff like that. Those things are very important. Definitely you want to do your homework and make sure you get the right information.
Yeah, and that's it's so common in IT. It is, almost every large vendor is using a lot of subcontractors. I worked on an incident in New York at the very beginning of January here over New Year's, and was in the city and was working with another IR firm, and everyone that showed up was a subcontractor, was basically just hired hands from Field Nation, that kind of thing. And nobody was actually an employee of the company that we were working with. So nobody had any institutional knowledge or any experience. They were all just hired hands that showed up to do the job. So as for people that are looking for contracting and looking for, IT positions, it's a great way to get experience and get a great way to, but from Mackenzie's point of view, there's a lot of risk because, you're whether, let me just throw out a name brand. Let's say you're hiring Xerox to do something, and Xerox is doing document management for you, and you're moving all your stuff in to a Xerox document management solution. But everyone you work with, you find out is a contractor and is not actually an employee of Xerox, and they're handling all your private data. They may be scanning in all of your intellectual property and a lot of stuff with PII and things like that. So you want to know, number one, is there an NDA in place? Is there a non-disclosure agreement between you and the company? But does that extend down to their subcontractors? Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the agreement between you and the company that you're working with, those agreements usually have an NDA in the agreement saying, your data is confidential between, you and us. But sometimes it doesn't talk about contractors or subcontractors in there. So that risk, that non-disclosure may not transfer to that user, to that contractor. That contractor may be able to go on Twitter and talk about, what they're doing with your data, and without, really any kind of recompense. So, really verifying in that agreement, and this is where kind of having inside counsel with your company is so important. I lean really hard on our lawyer all the time. I'm constantly sending him agreements saying, hey, does this cover this? Does this cover this? I know that's hard when you don't have access to that in an organization. If you don't have inside counsel, you can't just send an agreement off to a lawyer. But, making sure that agreement covers their contractors and their subcontractors is the number one thing. Number two thing is have a frank conversation with the company and say, hey, we're concerned about our privacy because you're using these subcontractors. How do we know that really our our data is being protected and being respected? How do we know that, it's not being mishandled? Because that data is probably being handled on that contractor's personal laptop, not a corporate device owned by that company that hired them. There's a lot of things to think about that way. And, is that really, is that the most secure way to treat your data? So some companies, when they hire a contractor, they issue them a laptop. And they say, okay, you have a 6-month contract with us, you're a contractor, but you're functionally going to be an employee. So in that case, it's a long-term contract. I'd feel safe in that respect. They're basically being onboarded for 6 months as an employee. So all the corporate security and everything's going to trickle down to them. So I would feel comfortable with that, but I wouldn't feel comfortable if it's just, they hire somebody, you sign the contract and then they just find whoever online in order to do the job for them, basically like hiring somebody on Fiverr. That's not really the same. They're not going to have the same level of corporate security. They won't have gone through the onboarding and everything. So those protections aren't going to be there for your data. So I think having that discussion with that vendor and saying, hey, these are my concerns, how are you going to address it? And but that's completely valid. And I'd be concerned about it also, especially with stuff like HR data.
Yeah, with respect to HR data, that kind of brings me to like the solution itself. Like, the proposed solution is it's a public-facing website, essentially, that uses an encrypted WordPress, a e-signature plugin offered by WordPress that offers an encrypted database, but still public-facing website.
Wow.
And we don't have the admin keys for it. Like, as far as like the back end, as far as I understand, the proposal is, we would manage the platform. And by we, I guess that means HR in this case, because IT wasn't looped in. But we wouldn't manage the hosting account, for example. So just going with like that kind of thing, for HR just really raises some red flags for me, and I could kind of see by the look on your face, it kind of raised a couple for you. So, I was wondering if you could help elucidate my concerns on that.
Right. Well, I'll let Kevin go first before I jump all over it.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like that's like that's a big red flag for me. It's just like, why do you not have access to that information? And what I guess what was the agreement you signed and everything? Like you can't just hide that information or keep it private. You definitely should have access to that information. That doesn't make any sense, especially if you're working with that specific company. You should be providing that information. Otherwise, it's a vulnerability. Like what Art said earlier before. Like I'm gonna bring that up again. We would hire contractors and we would get them access to our assets, our laptops. We would have it would be trickled down to security layers, and we know what you're doing with auditing and everything on it, just so we know that our information is not being leaked out. And that's one thing. And the other thing is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when you go for a job, if you're going for a job and you're being hired full-time for a job, typically when you're being hired for a full-time job, you do the HR onboarding process. And one of the agreements of that is basically you're not allowed to share that information. NDA, confidentiality, and a bunch of other stuff. Like, you're not allowed to do that. So what's going on with you right now, it's a big giant red flag for me. So I definitely recommend you're gonna have to try to unlock that key and try to get in there and make some changes there. And I'm not sure what Art wants to say, but that's just my advice.
Yeah. So to me, there's a couple things. I mean, number one, WordPress as a platform is highly vulnerable. So a lot of people run e-commerce on it. It's easy to set up a store. It is something that people run social networks. So WordPress allows you to do just about anything with it. So it's super powerful. But because its user base is so wide, it's constantly under attack. There's constantly hackers coming up with new ways to hack WordPress. So it's almost expected now that your WordPress is going to get hacked at some point, which is why there's the WP backup, plugins for WordPress. There are those, WP rollback plugins where if your WordPress does get hacked, you can just roll it back. Like it's almost kind of like that's the operational expectation now, is that that's going to happen at some point. Now, I feel because it's an encrypted database, if it does get hacked, chances are the data is still encrypted if it was done well. If that encryption key is not just sitting there on the server for the attacker to snag also, and then say, okay, well, I have your encrypted database, but I also have the encryption key, so I can just decrypt it, that kind of thing. If it was done well, which you don't know because it's not yours, they're building it, so you don't really know if it's done well, then at least I'd be more assured that the data is encrypted and safe, but I'd still be worried about the platform in general. Like, somebody could easily hack it and then put in some kind of proxy so that they're getting a copy of all the data that's being processed through it. Things like that. So there are some ways to mitigate this. If you're self-hosting it, is putting a web application firewall in front of it, making sure that all authentication to that system goes through an MFA provider, that's all SAML authentication. It all goes against, Duo or something, or Microsoft Authenticator, something to do your MFA with, so that when it's under attack, at least there's something that's going to notify your phone, that there's something going on when somebody's password's getting brute forced, etc. So those kind of controls I would layer in. And if you're self-hosting it, like if it's going to be your server, I would definitely put it on a DMZ in a segmented network, separate from the rest of your stuff. If it's going to be in Azure or something, spin up its own little Azure thing, because whenever I stand up WordPress, I just feel grateful, like all the WordPress sites I have out there, when my WP monitoring stuff is showing that it's still up. Like, to me, it's those of us who have had WordPress for a long time, it does get hacked. So that's my operational concern. But as far as security, with your data and really how to handle it with that subcontractor and everything, my assumption is that this was really acquired, and then it's kind of handed to IT, and they say, okay, we just bought this, or we signed this contract, here you go. And then this happens all the time, and IT really isn't involved in that acquisition process. And then it's like, okay, now we have this thing that really, we don't really agree with how it's set up. So a lot of times that is just having those conversations with the provider afterwards. And, I've had to do this before. Sometimes you just have to say, okay, I know we signed a contract for a year or 3 years or whatever, but we're not going to use it. We're going to we'll just count that as $80,000 we just, used, or 20,000 or whatever, and just walk away. And say, at this point, it's more risky for us to go to your platform than for us to continue with this migration and possibly get screwed. But if it's too late, like if you're already there, for companies that that are already, that the migration's done, and now you're learning what it's on, and you're learning who did the migration, and it was just outsourced to whatever country, and a bunch of people that you don't know and don't have an agreement with handled your data, and then everything is now set up and running in this environment that you don't agree with at all. At that point, I would say, okay, what can we do to make sure we have our data? What can we do to pick the right system and architecture in the future, and just plan for that going forward? Say, okay, here we are. We're in this high risk environment for the next 2 years. Let's find this is just where we are for now. Let's target our next good place. Let's target our landing spot for next time. And then whether it's Workday or Bamboo HR or whatever, and say, we're going to go to this next, and we're just going to accept the risk here. We understand that there's risk. Do what you can to manage that risk. Keep WordPress updated. Keep those modules updated, and try to protect it with firewalls if you can, that kind of thing, and just and concentrate on moving out of it in the future. That's really how I would handle it.
All right. Yeah. I mean, thankfully, I think we're in the early stages of that. And this was just something I kind of stumbled across by accident.
Yep.
I don't think I was supposed to know about it. So,
Yep.
um,
Yeah.
yeah, I feel like, it's probably an appropriate time to insert ourselves and, make sure that this is something that we would like to move forward with, and that is safe to move forward with.
Yeah.
So yeah, I appreciate you providing some context for these discussions that I feel like our department's going to have with our marketing team and HR team.
Absolutely, and there's a chance that provider has all amazing controls in front of the system. Like this WordPress thing may be hardened, highly managed, monitored, SOC behind it with firewall in front of it and all kinds of detection systems, and it like everything may be isolated and it may be highly protected, but unless you do insert yourself and find out, you never know. So that's really how to address that risk, at least from my perspective. Kevin, is there anything else you would add to kind of all these situations that Mackenzie's added?
No, you pretty much nailed it in the head. Like basically everything you said, like you answer all the questions. Basically, yeah. If you're already in a high risk, vulnerable area, like you're gonna have to plan out like what's your next company, or what's the next move you're gonna move over, because obviously you want that data not to be leaked out, right? So those things are very important. It's very important that you understand what's going on behind the scenes, because sometimes we think we know what's going on and we don't, and we find out that there's information out there that is being thrown out there and it's gonna hurt you, right? So you have to figure out and know what's going on behind the scenes. This is what I'm saying, like what I said before, like just figure out what's going on and where's that data is going and who has the data, who owns the data, and all that good information. So
yeah, that's perfect. And who owns the data is an important one, and that may be in your agreement, it may be in conversations with the sales engineering or with sales, but understanding that, because it's always your assumption, this is my data, I put it up here, but they may have in their agreement that they can mine your data, that they can, it becomes a part of your data set. You can't export it. You can't, or it costs $20,000 if you want to export your data. It costs a professional services project from them if you want to get off their platform. So there's definitely some caveats to that I've kind of learned the hard way over the years. And Kevin's really kind of drawing attention to that ownership of that. And what he had mentioned earlier at the very beginning, also Kevin had mentioned the data classification, is understanding what you're putting up there, whether it's confidential, whether it's intellectual property. Is there some kind of way that data needs to be protected beyond your normal text file that could be breached anywhere? Like, is this important PII? Is this important? And with HR data, it does contain a lot of PII, does contain a lot of information that really needs to be protected. And then it's reasonable to ask your vendors what controls they have in place to protect that data. And not only that, but again, with the WordPress solution, what they're doing to back it up. Like, if that server gets owned, how are they going to recover that? So whether your data is encrypted or not, like, how are they getting back up and running if that gets owned by a hacker? So yeah. Well, I really appreciate you coming on, Mackenzie. And it ton of great questions, and they've all centered really around third-party risk and more than third-party risk, really, that IT needs to be involved in these business decisions, because although the business is making a lot of outsourcing decisions, and every business does this, every single business that I've ever dealt with makes a lot of decisions based on cost and what they think of as transferring like operational risk to a hosted provider, et cetera, but they're not thinking about other risk. They're not thinking about the ownership of their data, the privacy aspect. They're not thinking about, really what happens if that provider does go down. It's cool to put everything in AWS, but what if AWS that goes down and you didn't set up redundancy between regions, that kind of thing. It's cool to go to this hosted provider that hosts in a private data center, but what if that data center gets leveled like, is there any way to get back up and running? And those are some ways to think about things. Well, Mackenzie, I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for your time today. And thank you, everybody that's listening, for your time. This was a great discussion. We are really thankful for your contributions. And everybody that's listening, make sure that if you have questions, please submit them to our form. We have a form, and you can either be a guest or just submit anonymous questions to the podcast. Please subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you're listening on. New episodes will typically come out every other Wednesday. And for more information, go to www.airiam.com.